Hi online students, hope you're having a great first week of classes. I'm going to try something new this semester. In the past I have recorded entire sections of the slides where I'm reading things that you could probably read yourself. So instead I'm just going to highlight areas that I think that need to be delved a little bit deeper for you all and allow you guys to think through some of them more critically. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to email me and let me know what they are, or let me know what you think of this format. So I'll start each week by just looking at the intro slide and just give you some heads up for the coming up weeks and anything that came out of class with the on-ground students. So this week we are going over about 4 sections around different things in public health, including an intro into what public health is, the changes that have happened in the past 120 years, things around the determinants of health, and lastly, health disparities. While we had class this week, there were a couple questions that students had around the syllabus or assignments, and I thought I'd share those questions and the answers with you as well. So students were asking about the groups. Do you choose the groups or do I choose the groups? And so what will happen is at the end of next week, I'll do a random list generator and randomly assign you all into groups. After that, either Sylvester or myself will create discussion groups for each of the groups so that you have that as a venue that you do not have to use but is available for you to work with your groups. I wait until after the first 2 weeks because there is some shifting that happens in those first 2 weeks, and I wouldn't want to put people in a group with someone who ends up leaving the class, for example. Another question was about the midterm and final exam. Students were asking if they are similar to the quizzes, and the answer is yes and no. The questions that you'll see on the midterm and final are similar, but the mode will be slightly different. With the quizzes, you have all the time in the world. They're open note and open book. For the midterm and the final, these two exams are closed note, closed book, and they're timed. And the timing is such that an online student it would be very difficult for you to be using other materials while you're working on them, just so that it's the same experience for the on-ground and online as we can. A question specifically for you all is, do these need to be proctored? And the answer is no. You will need to use Respondus Lockdown Browser to take them, but you do not have to go to a testing center to do this. You can do this from your home, work, library, wherever you feel most comfortable taking tests. Okay, so when we start this lecture this week, there's this little activity that you can go through that's just trying to highlight the difference between public health and healthcare. I want to kind of hone in on what is public health. And so public health, as you can read, the mission of public health is to promote physical and mental health and prevent disease, injury, and disability. And when the Institute of Medicine got together in 1988, they really made a change in how we saw what public health does. And so they define the role of public health as fulfilling society's interests in ensuring conditions in which people can be healthy. So it's moving from just individual activities to this kind of larger idea, and this formed the basis for the three core functions of public health. I really suggest that you guys watch this video, What is Public Health? This is a great video to just share even with your friends and family who may not know what you're doing and why you're in public health. It's put out by the American Public Health Association. Okay, so public health and medicine have been kind of siloed different fields for a very long time. There's a lot more intermingling today than there was when I first started this work, but still there are distinct differences, and really what we're trying to hone in on is that public health emphasizes prevention versus treatment, and the unit is the community instead of the individual. And beyond just like an illness model and addressing just the treatment of a illness that is presenting itself, public health is trying to go what we call upstream and create programs, influence policies to address multiple social and environmental determinants of health. And we have slides in this lecture that go over those. Okay, this is one of the really important slides of this week. And next week there's a little activity that you can do to kind of bring this home a little bit more. So when we think about public health and this systems way of thinking about it, there's this great framework that has been developed. And I'm just going to talk through it. Give yourself some time to digest it, and then again next week we'll talk about it a little bit more, and then there's an activity. So within this system and this framework, you see that environment is at the top. And environment is not just the physical environment, and it's really much, much more than the physical environment. The environment includes all those social and political and economic, cultural, demographic contexts in which we, in public health, are working. What we do in public health and how we address the needs of a certain community really has to be grounded in the context in which the system is in and resides. So, for example, the needs of communities and the makeup of communities differ. Before I was here in Johnson City, Tennessee, I lived in St. Louis, Missouri. Those are very different communities. One was an urban core versus what we would call more of a metropolitan or micropolitan community here, surrounded by more rural. St. Louis had a more diverse, culturally, racially, ethnically than Johnson City. But there was also a lot of things that were similar. The communities that were low income struggled in very similar ways in St. Louis as they do here in Johnson City. So again, there are some things that may translate very easily between different communities, and others that are very specific, and public health and the system of public health really needs to be attuned into their community. Okay, when we look at the public health system, really the bottom part is what we're going to talk about now, is the inputs and our outputs and the outcomes of those. So our inputs for the public health system relate to our structure. So these are the things that are necessary to provide the processes, or the outputs, which are in this case defined as the essential public health services. So our structure includes our governance, and we'll talk a lot more about these different aspects of structure next week in our lecture. But how we set up our governance. Is there a board of health? Is the health department part of a larger centralized system in the state, or is it decentralized? Our workforce, who makes up our workforce? The public health workforce is very diverse with lots of different skill sets, but depending on what type of workers you have and the makeup of your workforce, that really impacts what you can do as a public health department and within the public health system. Different things around the way the organization is set up, finances, excuse me, the financial aspects, and the informational piece. So if you don't have a lot of money and you don't have a large workforce and you have some organizational dysfunctions, that's going to really impact how you go about providing services to your community. And that will directly lead to changes in outcomes. And depending on how well we do our job of providing the essential public health services to communities, that has an impact on their overall health. And some of the sub-impacts that we want to make sure we're always thinking about is having an effective system with efficiencies that is equitable to all. And all of this, again, is influenced by that environment. So there's only so much the public health system can do to address the needs of the community. And those are impacted by those social, political, and economic factors that are external from the system. So this is really an important slide for you guys to just kind of digest and start thinking about how the public health system kind of works. And really, we're seeing a change in even the language we're using around public health. No longer are we just talking about traditional public health, which you see in this middle area, but really thinking about it from the full spectrum of population health. What we do in public health is influenced by and influences the healthcare system. And it is also influenced and influences, we hope, the social policies. So you'll hear a lot more around population health nowadays as this term that includes this broader spectrum and fuller view of how we in public health are working. And that's why I say public health and healthcare is working more closely and is aligning more closely now, because really we're working on similar outcomes just at different levels of analysis or levels of units of analysis. So you have the individual versus the community, but the healthcare system is just as impacted by the larger context as we are. Okay, and this is just, the next two slides are just illustrating that the public health system is beyond just governmental public health. Okay, as I mentioned, there are the three core functions. You're going to want to understand these and review them and kind of think through what they mean. But here, I think, is a good visualization that overlays the core functions of public health with the 10 essential services. So when the core functions were developed, there are these broad terms and and ideas of what public health should be doing. And really, the 10 essential services allows us to really operationalize what we really mean when we say public health's core function is assessment. So what goes into assessment? And we can see that within assessment, we have 2 of the 10 essential services: monitor health and diagnose and investigate. And again, you can see this for policy development and assurance. And with these 10 essential services, we can start to see how each different public health system and health department and within a state or within a region is addressing these 10 essential services, which informs if they're really meeting those needs of assessment, policy development, and assurance in their communities. Okay, and then we had this class activity, and we have it in a more interactive form for you all. And here are just some very important kind of unique features of public health. Public health has a basis in social justice philosophy. So in public health, we believe that everyone has a right to a certain level of health and well-being. And you see that in those core functions and 10 essential services that we are saying every community served by a health department health department should be providing assessment, assurance, policy development, and all of the 10 essential services to their communities. It's inherently political in nature. Unless you've been living under a rock or if not from the U.S., you probably have heard a lot about the healthcare reform. This is just one very magnified example of the political nature of public health. But it's inherently political in nature. It's dynamic, and there's an ever-expanding agenda. Almost annually, there's something new emerging that needs to be addressed by the public health system. We have a grounding in the sciences, and that informs the work we do. And again, that focus on prevention. Okay, a lot of this is stuff you may have heard about previously, so I'm going to go quickly through this section. So there have been 10 great public health achievements in the 20th century, and they're listed here. And so when we think back to or try to imagine what life was like 100 years ago or 120 years ago, we can see the great impact public health has made. And here, with this graphic, we see with the blue line, that's our life expectancy in years. And then in the green line, that's infant mortality rate per 1,000 live births. So when we compare over the last 115 years, the changes, they're pretty dynamic. So in 1900, an American would expect to live, on average, about 47 years. For many of us, we are reaching close to that age or above that and are very thankful that that is no longer the life expectancy. Especially when we compare that to the 2016 life expectancy, which is now averages 79 years old. Now this number is the average for life expectancy at birth in the United States. So in 2016, a baby born would expect to live to 79. What this number hides is the differences that we see between men and women and then between different racial groups, which we have a slide towards the end that breaks that down. But we see even more dynamic and drastic of a change is infant mortality. So 110 babies born per 1,000 would not live until their first birthday in 1900. And we've now made such improvements that that number's down to 6. 6 is still high compared to other industrial and Western countries. But when we're looking at the changes in America, this is a very important one. So we have about 30 plus years of increased life expectancy. And what's amazing about that is 25 of those years can be attributed to public health, compared to 5 for medical. And so when we think about the necessity of medical care and insurance and access, that's so key. But that's not everything. 25 of those 30 years were due to the foundational public health work of better nutrition, sanitation, safer housing, occupational safety, those 10 great achievements. So now that people are living longer, the effects of our environment and our behaviors that we've had over the course of our life is catching up to us. So we see, instead of a lot around infectious diseases, though we do have emerging infections, really the focus is on chronic conditions. And then here are the other lists of things that make up public health today. When we look at these two lists of the leading causes of death, we can see that the first 3 in 1900 were infectious diseases and diseases of infancy. Now we're seeing the 3 leading causes of death in 2014, and Sylvester updated this with the 2015 on the D2L site, so you can look at those numbers as well, is things that affect people as they age: heart disease, cancer, and chronic lower respiratory disease. I want to just focus then also on accidents. So this one is important because this is where, under unintentional injuries, where overdose deaths falls into. So it's a subset of accidents. So this number for number 4 is driven by not just accidents in the traditional, like motor vehicle accidents, falls and things like that, but also unintentional poisonings. Okay. And this kind of just breaks down those leading causes of death by age. The things that are affecting people at different stages from cradle to grave do differ. So you can see that, for example, for age 1 to 24, accidents is the largest chunk. When you look at our older aged Americans, age 65 and older, accidents doesn't even make the list. So take some time to review these and kind of think of what the implications are for this. Okay, so here are 10 leading causes of death, but I think this really helps to speak to the magnitude of the first 2. So heart disease compared to all heart disease and cancer compared to all others are really driving, the death rates in the United States. This just tells us that most of us will die of one day, of course, but likely we'll die from heart disease or cancer. The silver lining when we talk about death rates is that these are, for the most part, preventable. And that is where we come in public health. This gives you information about the healthy people. We're coming towards the end of the Healthy People 2020. This is going to be a really good resource for you when you're working on your project as a team, because the healthypeople.gov website provides actual metrics that they use to assess their leading health indicators, and they provide information on how well we're doing right now. So you can get some good statistics from this website. Okay, the third part is about determinants of health. And we break them into 5. You can see these in different ways broken up. But really, the important thing is to understand that our biology is our biology. And it's a very hard thing to change, and it does impact our health. It's only one of 5 determinants of health. And it's the interaction of all the above factors listed that determines the health of an individual in a population. So then the next few slides just goes through some of the different examples and definitions of like physical environment, biological factors, what we actually do, our lifestyle and personal behaviors. And then there's an activity. And you have this as well that you can go through. And I would recommend doing it because this really helps hone in on those different determinants of health. Okay, this really busy slide is busy because this is a complex system of factors that impact our health. So all those different determinants of health are interacting with each other. And then, in addition, they are impacted by policies and interventions, as well as basic access to health care. All of this together in this complex web leads to individual and community level health. And this is kind of a rhetorical question, but which policies affect health? And it's all of these policies. Health is not just affected by healthcare policy, but it's impacted by pretty much any policy that exists. So all of these different factors intersect with health. But just something to really think about is social position. Our class affects the other influences. Poverty/income is the main or the driving social determinant of health. It impacts all other determinants of health and is impacted by others. So poverty is associated with adverse health outcomes. And something very important to think about is that race in the United States, independent of socioeconomic status, is linked to mortality. So, though we understand that race is not biological, but it's a social construct, and we know it's a social construct because race is not defined the same across all cultures, across all countries, across all communities. But it's something that society sets up and categorizes people. So this thing that is a social construct, independent of your social economic standing, is linked to mortality. Okay. So this is the last of the figures, or the non-statistical figures, I guess, in this lecture. This is a really important one. This is the health impact pyramid, and I think it's a really good way to kind of frame what is possible in public health. So at the base is socioeconomic factors. The next layer up is changing the context to make individuals' default decision healthy. Long-lasting protective interventions, clinical interventions, and then at the top of the pyramid is counseling and education. Counseling and education, all of these are ways to impact health. We often think of counseling and education as a very individual activity. So that makes sense that it's at the top, because as you go from the bottom of this pyramid, there's increasing individual effort needed to make an impact on health. So the individual has the greatest effort when it comes to changing their health around interventions with counseling and education. At the bottom two are really where we think of as affecting the environment and the community to make it easier to be healthy. And so you see, as you go down, there's a larger population impact and also less effort by the individual. So if we could improve education, get higher literacy rates at 3 years old for all children in America, we would make a huge population level impact on the health of Americans. If we can improve the neighborhoods, the housing, the communities that people live in, that can have a major impact on health. The next level up is changing the context. So we do this all the time in public health. And we think of these policies that, for example, if you have a smoke-free campus, that makes it harder to smoke. It also keeps smoke off of our campus, which keeps us all healthier. If the options for lunch are healthy and cheap, that makes that easier to make that default decision be the healthy decision. Less effort on the individual. But again, policies like that, big P versus little p, so little p might be a policy for an organization, big P would be, clean air Act type policies. Those have an impact on people's health. So all of these are important ways to impact health, and we need counseling and education. We need clinical interventions. When we're talking about long-lasting protective interventions, these are the things that I think the best example would be vaccinations. So you only have to perform the behavior maybe once, maybe very often to get the impact you're looking for. And they're long-lasting. So it's very different to work to do interventions around long-lasting protective measures such as vaccination, where you just have to get someone to go in and get vaccinated at one time and you can make a big difference, versus changing someone's diet, and that's an ongoing effort that someone has to do. Okay, finally is our section on health disparities. So as I mentioned, we now have a life expectancy of around 79 years of age for Americans. And this graphic is very telling of how that breaks down and how we can see that not every community or not every race gets the same benefit as others. The good news is that all groups are living longer since 1970. So we're moving in the right direction. Now, if we look at this data, this was the best I could find in this format to share with you. But we've actually seen something disturbing happening where our life expectancy in the United States, which was trending upward, plateaued, and now has, for the first time since the mid-90s, started to decline. So we're seeing a dip. So this graphic doesn't provide us with that visualization, but that is something that we're dealing with right now in this country. But I want you to think and look at this and see, first by gender, we see that women live longer than men. And this is a life expectancy. And when we think about life expectancy, this is an average. So if you have more people dying at a younger age, that's going to lower your average. So what's one of the drivers for men having a lower life expectancy has to do with what we saw in the leading causes of death by age. So that first group of 1 to 24-year-olds, accidents was the largest cause of death. And something about men, you can Google, you can get on YouTube, and you can see a lot of examples, is that young men do some really unintelligent things around risky behaviors that lead to accidental death and also some morbidity things too. But that's why we see women living longer than men. That and that heart disease piece. So women, both white women and black women, live longer than white men and black men. But white women live longer than black women. And it's a pretty decent difference when we look at this. And there shouldn't be a difference in health based, again, on this social construct of race. what's even more alarming is the difference between black men and white men. Black men live significantly shorter lives than everyone else. And if you were to take the line in 2009 and draw a straight horizontal line, it would take you until somewhere in the 80s for white men to have the same life expectancy as black men in 2009. So black men are not seeing the same benefits of longer life as others, and they are actually living about as long as white men were in the 80s. So this is showing us age-adjusted death rates by state. The higher number is bad compared to a lower number. So the states with the darkest blue are those with the highest death rates, age-adjusted. And so we see that there's a clustering of dark blue in the southeast. This is the region that many of us reside in. And so this is an important factor to think about. Where you live, should that impact your life expectancy or the death rates? Should individuals who live in certain communities have a higher death rate than communities just next door? Tennessee borders two states that have lower death rates. So it should not, but it does. The Southeast is one of the poorest regions in the country. And remember that poverty is a major driver in the determinants of health. This also is, interestingly, the part of the country that chose not to expand Medicaid to their populations. On average, a few of the states were able to get it past their legislation or their governors, but for the most part, this area of the country chose not to expand Medicaid. Okay, so just to end this quick video for you, the social and economical factors influence life processes and are those powerful determinants of health. We know that poor people live shorter lives, but during that lifetime, they're less healthy than affluent people. So they're living shorter and less fulfilling lives. There are higher death rates for poor for almost all causes of death. And children are impacted by these trends as well. So we have lower levels of physical activity. We see higher lead levels in impoverished children. This is directly related to poor housing conditions, living in old homes or apartments that still have lead-based paint in them, for example. And so these differences are affecting children, and they're just putting them on they're not on the same playing field from the beginning. The reason we still see these problems is when we think about those things at the bottom of the health impact pyramid, those are really hard to change. Though they're going to give you the most impact for communities and for the population, they're very difficult to change. To change the social and economic environment, to create policies that may restrict access to unhealthy things. Those are hard things to do. And eliminating health disparities is similarly hard because it's going to require changes in those socioeconomic policies. True community-based programs that are of community input and buy-in from the beginning and throughout. Culturally competent services, so things that meet people's needs and are things that they would value and utilize based on their culture. And then an acceptance of people's right to health. So really that foundation of social justice. So that is all that I'm going to talk about today. Go ahead and do the little activities. Make sure you're caught up and read for next week.